Virginia folklorist, Dr. Patrick Gaynor, traveled around the state collecting ghost stories, family stories, from families around the state and from his students. And a 90-year-old woman from Raleigh County, West Virginia, told him this story, but she didn't want the family name used because she said some of her family members didn't like the way she told it. So I just call them the Smiths. And this is my telling of the ghosts of Echo Rock. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were a hardworking, God-fearing couple, and they were raising their 3 boys and their four girls to be the same. The family loved to work together, they loved to worship together, and they loved to sing together. Now, Nancy, the oldest daughter, was 17. She had the most beautiful voice, and her favorite song to sing was the old hymn, All My Life Long. Many a time during Sunday worship or on the Wednesday evening services, someone in the congregation would ask Nancy to sing. She would stand, open her hymnal, and then she would sing All My Life Long, and oh, how she could sing it. Well, it was one Wednesday evening service. It was in the summertime, and Mr. Smith had just led the congregation in the old hymn, the 90 and 9, when the door of the church in the back opened, and a young man carrying a backpack very quietly came in, very quietly set down his pack, and then he slipped into one of the pews. Mr. Smith called out to him. He said, "Son, come on up here and join us. You're most welcome." And the young man said, "Oh, thank you, sir, but I was just walking by, and I heard the most beautiful singing, and I had to come in and listen." Then someone asked Nancy to sing. She stood, opened her hymnal, and sang All My Life Long. Folks said that as she sang, the look of purest love washed across that young man's face. Well, after the service was over, the young man came forward and introduced himself. His name was Charles Parker, and he was from New York City. And he was traveling down through West Virginia. He wanted to get away from the city. And he'd taken the train to Grafton, had been walking ever since. Now, he stayed with families who invited him, but he could also pay his way. He had money. He wasn't a tramp. So Mr. Smith invited him to stay with the family. He said, "Well, the boys sleep up in the cellar loft, and there's plenty of room up there. You're welcome to stay with us." So Charles accepted. So everyone started walking back to the Smith's house. It was down the road a piece. And Nancy and Charles started to walk together. And Nancy tried to not show that she was pleased, but the family wasn't fooled. When they got to the Smith's house, they all gathered up on the porch to visit like we like to do in West Virginia. And Charles told them his story. His father owned one of the largest stores in New York City, and he wanted Charles to go into business with him. But Charles didn't want to do that. He wanted to be a singer. So he went away to college and studied music. And when he graduated, he returned home. Then Charles' father hired one of the best singers in New York to give him private lessons. And after about a year, Charles and the teacher decided that Charles was ready to give his first public recital. So Charles' father rented one of the big concert halls. He ran ads in all the newspapers, and he printed up tickets, and they all sold out. But Charles knew that most of the tickets had gone to business associates of his father or friends who were coming as a favor, but he really didn't mind. The night of the concert, Charles sang his best, and he felt he'd done a pretty good job. Except the next morning, when the newspaper reviews came out, the critics said, "Well, he sang well enough. He had a very pleasant voice, but Charles Parker just did not have the soul of a singer." This broke Charles' heart. And he knew he had to get away for a while. His parents thought that would be a good idea. And that's how he came to be in West Virginia. Well, over the next couple weeks, Charles fit right in with the family. He helped the other boys with the hoeing and the weeding and the work around the farm. And he and Nancy spent some time together, too. In the evening, They would walk down to Echo Rock. It was an outcropping just a little ways from the house. And if you stood back a few feet from the rocks and spoke into it, your words would come right back to you. And Charles made up a little song for he and Nancy to sing. And Charles would sing, "Do you love me, and will you be mine forever?" And Nancy would sing, "I do love you, and I will be thine forevermore." Well, after about another week, Nancy and Charles went to the Smiths and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Smith, now I know I've only been here a short time," Charles said, "but Nancy and I are in love, and we want to get your permission to get married." Well, the Smiths were overjoyed. They gave their permission right there, and they had come to love Charles as one of their own. And so they agreed that the next day Charles would return to New York City, take care of a few things there, then he would return, and he and Nancy would get married in the little church where they first met. The next day, Charles left, and Nancy moped around for a few days. But then she came down with a fever. And she didn't want to go to bed, but her mother said, "Nancy, don't be foolish. You want to be well for when Charles returns and plan your wedding." So Nancy obeyed. After about a few days, her fever broke and she felt better. So she sat up in bed and took her hymnal and sang her favorite hymn to herself. But just then, a deer ran into the yard. One of the younger boys went to get the hunting rifle. Now, fresh meat was hard to come by in those days. And he was running by Nancy's bedroom with that rifle when it went off. The bullet hit Nancy in the head, and she was dead before she hit the pillow. The family had no way of letting Charles know what had happened. They waited as long as they could for her funeral, 3 days. But they buried Nancy down at Echo Rock. Mr. Smith read some scripture, they said some prayers, and then the whole family sang All My Life Long. Then they returned to the house. It was 2 nights later, the Smiths were sitting out on their porch, and they heard a voice coming from Echo Rock. And what they heard was, "Do you love me, and will you be mine forever? Do you love me, and will you be mine forever? Do you love me, and will you be mine forever?" It was Charles. You see, he and Nancy had made an agreement that when he returned, he would go to Echo Rock and sing for her. She would answer him. They would join together and begin planning their wedding and their life together. The family all went down to Echo Rock, and they found Charles there. Mr. Smith took Charles aside and told him what had happened and showed him Nancy's grave. Charles screamed in anguish and threw himself on the ground and began to wail and cry, "He cursed the Lord." And Mr. Smith knelt down, put his arm around Charles' shoulder and said, "Son, Nancy has gone to glory. Now live so you can join her in glory someday." Charles composed himself, stood up, and they all walked back up to the house. The next day, Charles returned to New York, but not before. He made arrangements to have a marker put on Nancy's grave and to have a little white picket fence built around it. And he left money that there would always be flowers on Nancy's grave. About 2 years later, the Smiths received a letter from one of Charles' aunts. He had died. He'd never married, and he had never stopped loving Nancy. Well, some time after that, folks began to hear 2 voices coming from Echo Rock, but they couldn't make out what was being said. It always happened in the evening. It was most often in the summertime. And when they'd hear these voices, people would go down to Echo Rock to see who was there. But there was no one there, just Nancy's grave. But the woman who told Dr. Gaynor this story knew what those two voices were saying. You see, she was Nancy's youngest sister. And what those two voices were saying was, do you love me, and will you be mine forever? I do love you, and I will be thine forevermore.